Thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren. And for everybody who has their camera on, thanks so much. I love seeing people, and I'm going to do my best to sort of look at the chat as well, because I noticed that there's obviously a lot of participation, and we spoke about this earlier, Lauren. I'll do my best, but if I miss something, we'll always hit it up at the end. But definitely, do let me know if there are questions that come up, because I learn just as much, which I love. So without further ado, I'm going to start my timer as well to keep us on time, make sure that we do a good job of that. But first of all, many thanks to Lauren, to Jen, to Emily, to Nicole. I hope I didn't forget anybody, but greetings to everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. So what are we talking about here? So in the talk description, and it's funny, I always have to revisit that talk description because I'm like, what did I say I was going to talk about? But the most important thing is that I think we can all appreciate that in our world of sort of trying to create products and services and spaces and interfaces, there's all sorts of different experiences that we touch on a day-to-day basis. And the one thing that I have found time and time again, and it's actually a question that I've asked at several conferences that I've presented at as well, is I actually asked the assembly, hey, if you in this moment of time could think of 5 experiences, meaning any of the above, any product, any service, any space, any interface, anything that you've experienced, can you think of 5 that just blow your minds away, that just make you go, wow, this was fantastic? I'm not going to go through the exercise. I know we have so many different people, but even in your own minds, if you ask yourselves that question, people typically get about 2. They get as far as 2, and then they struggle to think past 2. Now I ask you, with the number of products and services and spaces and interfaces we touch on a day-to-day basis, why is this so difficult? Why is this so difficult? We should be rattling these off like nobody's business, but it's not happening. So we realize very quickly that experiences can actually be a struggle. So that's one side of the equation. Let's look at the other side. Let's put ourselves in the moment that many of us are in, which is that we work in organizations where we try to address these moments of struggle. We try to address what the consumer is going through at a given time, where they might be struggling. And our goal is to try and make it better for them. Our goal is to provide them with value. But in that moment, we realize that there is something that we all face, which is we have constraints. We have very little budget. We have very little time. There's not enough people on our team. We might not have the knowledge that's necessary to actually address it. And that is a struggle in every organization. I've never met an organization to date that has just said, none of these are a struggle. At least one, if not all 3, are a struggle. So those are sort of 2 sides that I want you to consider, because we're going to keep on talking about those 2 sides. And our goal ultimately is that we actually seek to create some sort of balance, some sort of care for not only the needs of our consumers, but also for the people who put in all the effort to put those products out, the creators. If we talk about designers, if we talk about product development, if we talk about engineers, we talk about marketing, we talk about developers. These are all the people who are putting their smarts into something and trying to put it out to the world. But we have to take care of the consumers, and we also have to take care of our teams internally. And what we're trying to do is bring ourselves to some level of balance. But the reality is also that these moments in time, they leave us sort of with a steady stream of questions that always need answers. There are questions that abound in organizations. And a lot of times, tell me if this is true or not. You can even wave to people on the camera, or I'm looking at the chat. You know that sometimes those questions sort of get trapped in your mind. They don't actually come out. They don't actually get shared, because you are literally moving so fast to the next meeting or to the next moment in time, or the next, oh my gosh, we have this deliverable, or we have this, presentation that we have to make. You're moving so quickly that a lot of times this steady stream of questions somehow get left behind, or they just get trapped in your mind where they actually never get out. They never actually make their way out into the real world. And in that moment in time, you realize that, oh my gosh, how are we actually addressing these questions? Which is a fair thing to ask. Let's dig into those questions a little bit more, though. As you can imagine, with those questions that we have sort of trapped in our minds, those questions are often about people and product. It's pretty simple, right? What are people thinking about? If I'm thinking about traveling the world, what do people think about traveling? Do they like to travel last minute? Are they the kinds of people who like to plan in advance? We ask ourselves all of these questions, but we want to know about these people. We also want to know about our product. Were you able to find what you were looking for? Did it actually present to you the search results you were looking for? Did you feel comfortable with the way it was presented to you? We have questions about our people and our product. But here's what happens. This is the challenge. We often, as teams, equate our understanding of people to their use of our product, and that's it. So I met Lauren. Lauren uses Zoom. And really, there's nothing more about Lauren that I need to know because she uses Zoom. I mean, she's perfect, right? Nothing wrong with Lauren. We already know that about Lauren, but there's nothing wrong with her because she uses Zoom. That's it. But that seems very shallow, doesn't it? And in doing this, in looking at people this way, where we just literally connect them to the product and think about them in terms of our product, we actually disconnect ourselves from people. We actually create some distance. And that is actually incredibly unhealthy because what happens is we start to slowly increase that gap. And as the gap keeps on increasing, we know less and less about the people and just focus solely on the product. But here's the catch, is that that product has to embed itself in the person's world. The person does not have to embed itself or themselves in the product world. And we have to sort of recognize and appreciate these realities because they exist. So let's take that one step further, sort of stepping us into this, is that, okay, we have questions, we need answers, we think about people as product interactions. What starts to happen is then we sort of accept answers based on some sort of extrapolation, some sort of intuition, some sort of guess that just seems good enough. This is good enough for now. Let's just keep moving. That whole concept of MVP, those 3 letters, really grate on my nerves beyond belief. And if I had a shot glass for every time somebody said MVP, I would be drunk under the table. That's not a good thing. The key is we have to, I know Cynthia's like MVP. I'm like, where's my shot glass? But the key is that literally it's just going with the good enough. It's good enough. Let's just get this out. It's good enough. This is fine. And we have to think a little bit more beyond that. We have to challenge ourselves a little bit more beyond that because actually good enough just starts to act as a proxy to feeling connected. And the problem is that we actually end up with very low confidence answers. And confidence is a big part of this. You know, it's connected and you notice confidence. And these 2 things really are important for us to understand the people that we service. Confidence is a funny thing. It's either high or low. It's not medium. Although people love to say when we ask them about what's your confidence in something, they're like, it's pretty good. But that means it's low. It's binary. And I hate to break that to you guys, but that is a truth. So we need to avoid these low confidence answers. But the sad part is coming right back to the beginning where I just started with you all, is that reduced connection, reduced confidence, having this proxy is then reflected in the products that we build. And that gets to a moment where it becomes uncomfortable. We as creators don't feel good about what we're putting out there. And the people who are trying to consume our product either feel a bit trapped or they just don't feel catered to. And ultimately, we see that connection dwindle. And it's a really sad moment, quite honestly, because human connection is something we all thrive on. And we want to create more connection. We want the whole purpose of having products and having, this thing called the web and this thing called the internet is that we can create these connections. So how do we actually move in that direction? How do we move in that direction where we can reach people and we can hear what they have to say? So our goal is to deepen connections and bolster confidence when designing anything, And I really mean that. But at the same token, making sure we deepen our connection with consumers and make sure that the teams internally feel inspired. They feel good about what they're creating. We need to give them confidence in what they're creating so that when they put something out, they know they did their best job and they feel good about it and they can just build and build and build and keep on building. That's really what we're trying to understand here. And actually, the service that provides that is qualitative research. It can actually provide that service to the organization. Now, the kicker always is that in many organizations, qualitative research actually doesn't have a place in the development process. In that design and development process, it's a nice to have. When it can actually be the unifying force, when it can actually be the moment in time where the entire organization rallies around the same consumer, because it's not as if marketing is going after one set, development is going after another, engineers are going after another, designers are going. Ultimately, you're all catering to the same people. And it is the unifying force that brings everybody together. It's the service to the organization that can make that difference. So we have to understand a little bit more about this then. How do we leverage qualitative research to provide that unifying moment? Just a note on Twig and Fish. So Twig and Fish is a micro agency based in Boston. So I see my Boston peeps online, and to my Canadian peeps, I'm from Canada. So that's exciting as well. But it is a micro agency basically based on really trying to position qualitative research in those moments where we can challenge, where we start to accept things as a proxy, or we can challenge low confidence. And we can make it a moment where everybody actually starts to center around that human story. The best part about this is it can be done. So many of you might think, oh my gosh, well, you know what? It's really hard because you don't know my stakeholders or you don't know the product I'm working on. I believe there's always going to be challenges, but that's sort of why we all sign up for this anyway, is a bit of fun of challenge. But the focus for Twig and Fish is to really position qualitative research in a way that succeeds, in a way that people perceive it as a strategic tool to actually bring everybody together. I will say, we're not a pub. A lot of people see the name of this company and somehow think we're a pub. So maybe that's version 2.0, and maybe you'll all join me for a drink at some point in our lives together. That would be fantastic. But for now, we'll talk about Twig and Fish Research, the qualitative research agency. So as we go through this, what I wanted to do is sort of, yes, exactly, very British pub-esque. It literally comes down that way, which I love the name of British pubs. They're just, to me, pristine. But I'd like you to look for takeaways that you can maybe reflect on your own organization's approach. What are details that your own organization does or does not do? And maybe you can look at those takeaways and sort of see if it applies to you. I'm going to cut to the punchline. Structure and transparency lead to confidence and connection. That is everything I'm going to share with you right now. These are the ways we can position research so that it is well structured. We have what we need in order to go through a fixed number of steps, but we also have transparency, because we also know that when we are transparent about details, when we are open and we welcome people in, it actually starts to make people believe in what's going on. It makes people want to partake of the process that we have in front of them. And it starts to ultimately not only create connection internally, but externally as well. So let's talk about how this actually manifests. What I want to do is use an example that we did with the City of Boston, boston.gov website. And I would love to be able to share this as a way of sort of showing examples of every step that we went through so that you can think about, again, how did they actually do that and what are they actually talking about? So we have a 5-phase learning process. I just want to walk you through this very briefly. Our first phase is align. And the first phase really has to do with making sure everybody, as I was speaking about earlier, those questions that are stuck in your head, or maybe, Jeffrey was walking down the hallway and had these ideas in his head, but he hasn't had a chance to talk to Matthew. And the two of them have crossed paths and they're having conversations about their same product, but they haven't had a chance to really get out the questions that they have in their mind. So Align really gets out those questions and understands what is the intent of your questions. As you can imagine, and many of you might have experienced this in your own experiences, sometimes if you're given a question that is not really well defined, you start going down the path, you start going through phases 2 through 5, literally, and then you realize you're actually going after the wrong thing. And people start to go, wait a minute, that's really not answering our questions. So it's important to stop, make sure everybody's on the same page, and make sure everybody's study intent is very, very clear. Once you have that and you have a very clear learning objective, what you want to then do is actually start planning. And planning, we're familiar with this. It's the basics of getting the recruit in. It's understanding how we can create a protocol so that we can place it in front of people and sort of elicit the engagement that we're hoping for from people who can hopefully inform our learning objective. We have that, and we also have one additional point here to raise, is that we make sure that the stakeholders themselves are a part of this process all the way through. So here we'll make sure that they know who's being recruited. They understand what that protocol is. What is the specific discussion guide that we've put together and the approach that we're taking? But we also really focus on how they will be engaged. They are observers to this research process. It is important to understand that they don't bear the burden of putting the study design together. They're just there to really listen and soak in on that human story. And yes, Parker, Align would be accomplished with stakeholders in specific sessions. And there's ways that we can get into that in more detail, but I haven't gotten into that quite yet here, but we can always chat about that afterwards. So plan really pulls it all together in terms of how you put the nuts and bolts together, and gather really executes your plan. If you've done a good job of planning, gather means you walk out, you start to get all of those stories that you're looking for, you capture it in whatever method that you think was most appropriate for the learning objective, and you take the time to debrief in between and make sure that whoever the stakeholders are, whoever that team is around you, is listening in and sharing their thoughts in the moment. Not concluding or solutioning, but just sharing their thoughts. Once gather is done, we go into analyze. Analyze is that moment where we really start to dig deep into the data. You want to start to take it apart. You want to deconstruct it, come up with different ways of synthesizing it, potentially using different frameworks, but you want to make it consumable to whoever it is. All that data has to be consumable to whoever it is who's ultimately going to apply our last phase, apply it forward. It has to be able to move forward. It has to be able to make sense and be used. Now, you'll notice that these are very specific terms. It's not to say that we're trying to templatize qualitative research, but the important part to take away here is this is language that's easy for everybody to remember. And within it, there's lots of variety that can be had. So just by having this light structure, our first takeaway, create language around gathering and socializing human learning. If you have repeatable language, then people start to use it. People start to go, hey, are you in the middle of a study? Yeah. What are you in? We're actually in Analyze right now. Oh, that's lovely. Guess what? I'm going to actually join you for your workshop where you actually piece apart the data. Fantastic. And people start to use the language. And you want people to embrace the language so it becomes recognized not only the fact that you're conducting qualitative research, but it's much more than phase 3 gather. It's the entire 5-phase process that talks about the research study and the research study design. And I have a question from Leanne. When you involve stakeholders in the gather phase, do they ever hone in on parts of the stories that become less relevant? Just hold that thought, and I'm going to probably answer that. So let's talk about that in just a little bit, okay? So what I want to come back to with the City of Boston is they actually sought to understand how city information was being obtained in some neighborhoods and some cultural groups. And what they were ultimately trying to understand was, why weren't residents using the City of Boston website? So if you can all take a moment and sort of apply this to your own worlds, You probably have had some line of questioning at some point in time where you've said, why isn't somebody using my app that I've put together? Or why isn't somebody using my website? Or this, printed documentation that we've put together in order to be able to understand a little bit more about our services. Whatever form that takes, we've all had this kind of question in some shape or form. If we start to step through the 5 phases, which I just very briefly want to take you through, just a quick snapshot, the question in a line very quickly became, well, does the City of Boston website create a sense of trust and confidence? And that was sort of the question that they were driving with. Does that website create a sense of trust and confidence? And what we realized was, well, typical solutions they would try to hit up is, if you had this kind of questions, the first thing they're going to do is talk to the designers and say, let's increase trust and confidence characteristics in the website. Let's make it more trustworthy. Let's make people feel more confident. And that's a very common way of addressing these kind of moments. We just sort of jump to it. What that's being based on is unclear. The other way to solve it is just ask residents why they didn't use the website as an information source. Why didn't you? Fair question. Okay, so why didn't you? But let's dig into that a little bit more deeply, because there's a little problem with that question as well. Let's take it step by step. So does the City of Boston website create a sense of trust and confidence? If we ask ourselves that question, well, we can answer it, but there's really little contribution to anything meaningful in terms of improvements. It doesn't really get us to where we have to go. Well, does it or doesn't it? It's a bit close-ended. And we're not left with anything more than, okay, it doesn't, so now what? So what we have to do is unpack this question a little bit more. And this is where I just want to slow things down just a wee little bit. So let's back it up and say, well, maybe we'll ask ourselves, how can the City of Boston website generate a sense of trust and confidence? The challenge here is that, as I mentioned just on the previous slide, we're not sure what people are basing this on, so we could ask the designers to go at it. But quite honestly, to me, that's very unfair to the designers. It's placing an onus on them where they actually don't have a definition of trust and confidence from the resident point of view. They have it from their point of view. But we all know this. We're all practitioners, and we know that we can't just base it on what we believe all the time. Sometimes it does happen, yes, in organization, but we know very well that we have to look beyond that. But the problem is we don't have that definition of trust. We don't have that definition of confidence from the resident's point of view. So now we end up doing what we spoke about earlier. We sort of base it on intuition. We have a few guesses. We think we know. We might move forward with that. But it leaves us with a little bit of low confidence. And quite honestly, very quickly, the team's going to find out it's not primed for ideation at all. It can't really answer all the different ways they can do this. So there's a pause. So let's back it up one more step and ask ourselves, okay, so if we don't have that information, maybe we should find out how residents actually determine if information from the city is trustworthy and it generates confidence. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. We can figure out how people define trust. We can figure out how they define confidence. We can understand stories in terms of their interaction. Now this is starting to pick up our confidence, because if we have this, you would agree with me that the next step that I just came from is easier, because the designers will actually have characteristics of trust and confidence, and they can actually move that forward and think of all the different ways, because they're brilliant. They'll think of all the different ways it can be manifested. But let's ask ourselves a little bit more, because some of us who are qualitative researchers know we like to dig a little bit deeper. And for those of us who are non-researchers, we might go, yeah, Mina, but this is great. How are we actually going to believe what people say? I always love that question. But we do have to ask, okay, so let's address that. And the way to do that is quite simple, is let's ask residents just how they determine if information is trustworthy and if it is the type of information that generates confidence. Not necessarily about the City of Boston, but anywhere. Let's actually understand their definition of trust. Beyond Lauren equating to a Zoom product, we want to know all about Lauren. We want to know about who Lauren is. We want to know about what else she feels she trusts, maybe examples of brands or experiences that she trusts. Break it down for us, Lauren. Tell us more. Tell us a story. What is this all about? And what that does is it starts to get our confidence much higher up. Because now we not only have characteristics from other experiences, we also have characteristics that will relate to the city of Boston. And between the two, that design team is brilliant. They will figure it all out and move it forward into the best options possible. So you see how I've sort of very slowly backed us into this, but I just wanted you to see how that happened and sort of the thought process that went in there. Your takeaway here is unpack the confidence. Unpack the confidence in existing knowledge and connect that human story to the team. Show the team where it would make sense. Show the team why it would make sense. Take that moment in time to sort of really figure it all out, because it's imperative that everybody's on the same page and everybody comes together for that. So let's talk about plan then. So we have plan. And the key here is that with plan, and I noticed that there's a few questions around this, I'll definitely hit them up afterward, but I just want to make sure we get through the data and the stuff in time. So I'll keep moving here. But in plan, we now have a very clear understanding of what it is we're going after. So now, as you can imagine, we have to figure out who are the people we actually learn from in this particular situation. We find out what, we sort of ask ourselves the kinds of data you need. What kinds of data? Is it about behavior? Is it about aptitudes? Is it about emotions specifically? What is it about that we actually want to learn? We also ask ourselves how, because as you all know, there are so many different ways to collect this information. There's so many different methods we can apply. And we only talk about methods here, by the way. We never lead with method up front, which a lot of people tend to do. It only really starts to come into play once we are very clear on what that question is, what that objective is that we're going after. And then we always want to have a why. Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it this way? And how can we actually move forward? Within this particular points in plan, we also start with the ideal. And we start with the ideal because we want to always make sure that we approach things with the ideal, that we are always exposing to the team, the extended team, the stakeholders, whoever might be thinking about doing more of this. What's the best way to answer these questions? We then apply whatever constraints we have, and then we go to the adjusted. And the rationale here is it's important to show those two so that people understand the sort of best approach and then understand what they might have lost when you actually go from the ideal to the adjusted. And it's really, really important to understand that connection, because if we just always lead with the constraint, nobody's ever going to be informed. No stakeholder will ever know that there might have been a better way to do this. So this is our moment in time to make sure that we responsibly share that, and then also not be dogmatic and understand how we can pare it back based on those details. Okay. Let's move to phase 3 now. So that's gather. And our goal, as we mentioned, was to capture multiple stories, to really get an understanding of what these differences are in terms of trust, in terms of confidence, how people define it, what are characteristics, what are sort of those details in terms of what we want to learn so that we can take those definitions away and apply it to the City of Boston website. So in our session, we'll learn about the resident, and then we come to their first experience that they share with us. And they might say, oh, okay, you know what? I had this experience. It was actually looking up information on a travel website, and I was really hoping to book a trip. And I really struggled with it because I couldn't find out what I was looking for. So then in order to find stuff on the website, I sort of went onto Google, and then they start to tell you their story. They start to tell you all of those stories, and you get all of the details encapsulated in their story, and you hear it and you record it and you're listening. Then you might say, okay, well, now let's talk about the City of Boston. Tell me about a time you did that. Tell me about a time you looked up information or were seeking information that was city-based. And here they might say, okay, let's talk about this particular incident where I was trying to figure out which side of the street I park on, because everybody who's in Boston knows it's parking is at a premium and it's impossible to find a parking spot. So let me tell you about that story, and maybe they'll go into that detail. And then maybe just for fun, we'll also ask, what about that ideal world of finding information? Because our goal is to step them through and maybe even get some characteristics of the ideal from them, so that again, the people designing can think about those characteristics to move things forward. And here we end up with then sort of 3 points in time. If we look at this moment of activity based, when you actually, and this is a shared canvas, just to go back to this for 1 second, this is a shared canvas, whether you're doing it in front of the person with a big, printout on a piece of paper and you're taking notes together and you're sort of actively involving them in note taking while you are talking and they're talking, or if it's on a mural or a Miro, whichever you prefer, it's a nice way to actually get them to participate in that moment of story sharing. And it's wonderful because we want to do more of this and we want to encourage the story as opposed to just very finite answers to questions. So using activity-based protocols really help generate those stories that evidence patterns. Because now if I know somebody does something with a travel website, and when looking up information about COVID protocols, and then when looking up information with the city of Boston, I can see that there are patterns that I can go across, and I can actually start to understand what some of those characteristics are that are interesting to me, which is exactly what we do in analysis. So then we take all this data forward, we take our stories and we unpack them. We hear interesting points about the story. So maybe somebody says, I prefer that my son is with me. I get guidance from my son. I feel like I trust him. He'll avoid me going in the wrong direction. We get sort of those characteristics. Is it personal help? What is it that's helping this person along? What is giving them that sense of confidence and trust? And maybe we get to that second story and we hear something else. We hear a little bit more detail. The Facebook group I belong to, that actually really helps use language that I trust and that I start to understand. Especially with second language speakers, we found that this was a very important finding. And what we start to do is make connections. And I always love to think of data and connections as, if you have 1 point, and if you only have 1 point, it's 1 point. But when you have 2 points, it's a line. But when you have multiple points, you know where I'm going with this. It starts to take shape. It starts to create shape. And we love it when data has shape. So in our third story, maybe they start to talk a little bit more about details. There's bite-sized pieces. I can translate if I have to. They start to tell you more. And I'm obviously simplifying this here because it's lots of data, but you understand what you try to drag out of the stories. You try to get that inspiration from the stories of how people are pulling out these details. And the more you have shape, the stronger you can feel about certain characteristics. The thing I would say here, and I can't remember now, I'm trying to keep up with the chat, but who asked me about, well, what about the stakeholder in phase 3 potentially, who starts to just sort of go off about one particular point of data? The key here is, and this one I want to really stress, is when looking at this kind of rich data, this kind of thick data, don't reduce it to numbers. We're very tempted. 3 out of 5 people said this. 5 out of 7 people said this. 8 out of 10 people said this. But let's not reduce it to numbers. It's about the variety of data. Our goal is to understand that variety and how that variety inspires the team. How it actually gets them to think a little bit deeper. Maybe I should be looking at this. Maybe I should be looking at this. Oh, wow, 1 person said this, but that's really interesting. If it starts to increase that sense of curiosity and it starts to inspire the team, it can make all the difference. So we want to start to look away from the numbers and start to look at the variety. Now, I'll just pull aside for 1 second. If you do want numbers, you can always link this to a quantitative study. It's very easy to get those numbers, but that really belongs with quantitative studies. And that is what the bonus is you get lots of, you get numbers, you get volume. But this provides that variety of rationale of understanding just what the landscape is. And then our final phase is apply. And in apply, what we really want to do is think about what we've just learned. Well, we've deconstructed, trust and confidence characteristics. We now know some of the dribs and drabs that go into trust and confidence. How can I define that? I will have to think about those details, and then you pull that out, and we want to ultimately apply it to the City of Boston websites. We also have so much inspiration just based on attitudinal, emotional, resident sort of recounts of stories. Attitudes and emotions are wonderful because the data is often longer lasting. So we can use that as inspiration for longer periods of times. Our attitudes and emotions tend to last for longer. We have evidenced resident experience. It's not just one singular experience about the website and trying to find details on parking. It's now across, it's variety, it's that landscape, but it's multiple points of evidence that we feel more confident with. And we have that sense of connection and confidence then, because now everybody has heard the story. You are shepherding them along with you as you might run such a study. For the non-researchers, it's just about listening and partaking. You don't have to worry about the way to ask the right question, which is a different discussion in of itself. You don't have to worry about those details. Your job is to just listen and soak it in as much as possible. And as you soak it in, and as you talk more about it in the debriefs, as you talk about it in analysis and raw data analysis sessions, you then start to create a sense of connection. You start to see those different viewpoints, and you start to gain confidence that it's not just your definition of trust and confidence, it's the residents and how they are defining it. And what this basically did was it yielded high confidence for the design team in terms of how the city could actually start to think about applying those factors into the website. And those details were actually embedded in the website then. What was beautiful is, you can probably all guess this, is when you make things easier for populations who might not comprehend English as their first language, and you make things more consumable for them, and you sort of use that simple language and you start to increase the clarity, you all know the answer here, everybody benefits. So it was a great way for the team to really step through these details that made the difference in them consuming that information. The takeaway with my phase 5 apply here is really socialize and leverage that human story so that you can actually bring meaning to what's created. The designer going in to create and update the website in order to make that difference feels so much better. At the end of the day, I believe all the people who are creators of any product never create the product to put out something that's subpar. Nobody goes out with that intent. I do not believe that. I think everybody earnestly wants to do the right thing, wants to help someone, wants to solve someone's problem, or maybe even make a very impactful difference depending on what domain you're in. You know that sometimes the products and services you put out can really emotionally connect with people in a way that can make incredible difference. If we're talking about medical devices, if we're talking about moments for people trying to get access to information that is really important to their lives and their livelihood and their existence, we can make so much difference. And we go out intending to make that difference. But when we distance ourselves from that human story, the product suffers. Quite honestly, everything suffers. Not only does the product suffer, the people who are the creators suffer as well. They become less invested. Maybe they check out. There's all sorts of things. And we've done some very interesting studies on that as well, if anybody is interested. But we don't believe that's why people set out to do this. It's to create that meaningful moment. It is to make it so that somebody says, wow, I can't believe this. This just exceeded all expectations. That is our intent. So as you can imagine from this, and this was a very quick snapshot of the detail that went into this, the city of Boston was actually able to confidently incorporate what it meant to be trustworthy, what it meant to generate confidence, so that it started to serve its residents much better. And this was ironically pre-COVID. Wow, they were tested during COVID and all of the information that people ultimately relied on for their own existence. So these were moments that started to really impact the city, but also impact their appreciation for where and when you have to position that human story. So I leave you with a question here, which is good enough really an option? We went back to that statement, oh, it's just got to be good enough. But is good enough an option when designing products? Can we really look at it that way? When it really doesn't take a lot of extra time, think about positioning. Think about the positioning of qualitative research, where it belongs in your organization, in your process. If you think like, oh, well, I have to fight, I have to fight about this. Well, the question is, it comes back down to confidence. Where are you getting your confidence from? Confidence is high or low. So where are you getting your confidence from? Because ultimately, you want to make sure you not only create confidence, you build that connection. And it's through, as I mentioned at the beginning, punchline, that structure and that transparency. So we need to make sure that we step through these moments. We keep people, we hold their hand, we make sure that it is held all the way through so that there's no questions about why we're doing this, what we're doing this for, but that everybody's confidence keeps on going up and their sense of connection to that human story keeps on going up as well. Just want to say thank you so much. I have a few minutes to spare, thankfully, so it didn't go over, but Lauren, I hope that worked.
That was perfect. And thank you so much, Mina. Everybody give Mina a round of applause. That was super, super inspiring and lots of great questions in the chat. Keep the questions coming and I will go ahead and ask you a few things.
Sure.
And let me make sure I've got my notes up. So a couple of questions about the align phase that you mentioned and how you do this with stakeholders. Is it through stakeholder interviews? Does it come with internal workshops, something else? What do you recommend there?
Absolutely. And I just shut the presentation down so I can actually see all of you like this because I felt like my eyes were going over to my other screen. Great question. Yes, it is through a workshop. It's through a very specific tool that in case anybody has ever seen Twig and Fish present this tool, we call it our phase 1 aligned workshop. And it is a 2x2 that we put together called the Incredible Framework. What happens when researchers brand, but there's a reason for that name, sadly. And it's stuck now, so we're sort of stuck with it. But the key is that it is a simple 2x2 that we actually walk through. And for anybody who's interested, I will just throw it out there that I'm doing a session on this at UXPA International as a workshop. So I'm actually walking people through in June in San Diego. So if anybody wants to join, you can absolutely look it up. But that 2x2 basically helps really unpack. So what I did in unpacking that question was really all about thinking about how to unpack that question really is what we use the 2x2 for. And it's a workshop that we take all of our stakeholders through, make sure that they have a chance to sort of put everything out of their heads, get those questions out, and then unpack each one and ask ourselves what the actual question really needs to be. And ultimately where things have to start. So we start answering the questions appropriately and we ultimately address what really needs addressing. So it's through a very carefully facilitated workshop.
That's great. I think, specifically related to the example that you mentioned of increasing trust and confidence, there are a lot of questions on how did you align on those things as the biggest problem areas? And how did you, I think I saw something pop up, if you have a very solution oriented team or stakeholders, and how do you get them to the real human side of things? So kind of two-part question there.
Absolutely. Let's take the first one, which is how did they even understand that it was trust and confidence?
Yep.
And that's where you can use like, okay, their previous data. That team sort of arrived upon that because they had looked at their own data. They had done some initial sort of like discussions with people internally and externally, but they realized that that was what was going down pretty quickly, is the trust and confidence level. So they had come to us with that issue and said, we've done our initial, oh, sorry, that's my timer going off. Sorry, they had done their initial sort of investigation of what was going on, but they were still very tempted to just go ahead and say, can we just run a usability test? Can we just do a test of the website and see where people are faltering? And the question is again, don't equate it to your product. Step away from the product for a second and understand, what are people talking about when they talk about trust and confidence? Deconstruct those factors first. The second half of your question, I'm so sorry, I might have lost it now.
No
Can you
worries. I
repeat
think
it?
it was more about like if you have a very solutions oriented team or
Yes.
stakeholders, like how do you get them to refocus then on the real human needs versus what
Yes.
you're talking about is like the specific usability issues.
Yes, yes. And that is a great point too. So the question is it's sort of back to that first step that I put in, which is like, well, does it create confidence or not? Okay, if it doesn't, let's throw it over to the designers. What we do is when you have these kind of conversations and you ask people, what are you basing this on? Some teams will actually go forth, and let's be very honest here. Some teams will just go forth and say, yeah, we know how to solve this. That's fine. If they have high confidence, then that's fine. But if it comes back with the same problems, that should be telling us something first. So we always ask those questions. But the second half of it has to do with the confidence in that existing knowledge. If
Yep.
even one person in the room, and I really mean this, if you have a team of people sitting around a table or a team of people on a Zoom session, and if even one person goes, I don't know if this is the right approach, it has to be investigated, because that one person's voice is going to get louder and louder, and it's worth the ask. And plot that confidence, plot their understanding in what their confidence is in their knowledge sources. And if they go, we're all high confidence, then carry on, because you don't have a problem clearly, and nobody will use your website. So it'll come back around at some point in time and rear its ugly head. But if it doesn't, and somebody says, you know what, hey, some of you want to be solutions oriented and just keep on popping out a solution, but some of you want to go deeper on this, it behooves the conversation. And then the question is, how do you do it?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question that popped up is, say you get aligned on a problem, but then when you get into the interview, you're getting a lot different answers than you may have expected, and it's not really what you intended or the way that you had intended the things to go. What do you do in that case? What do you recommend?
If with good alignment, it's actually, to be honest with you, and I'm really trying to think deeply about an example to agree with you. It's actually very hard with good alignment to end up in a session where you suddenly end up with data that is pointing in a completely different direction. If data starts to point in a completely different direction, then maybe the team is not as informed as it needs to be, and maybe that is a reality check for them as well. But it's honestly very rare that happens. Now, let's play it through though. Let's say it happens. The first thing I would do is I would come out of the sessions and say, well, we have learned something. Again, that is what we seek, is that variety of information. Maybe our entire hypotheses were wrong as a team, and me as a consultant, slightly different than me being internal to an organization. But as a consultant, I can say, like, you know what, guys, maybe we need to look at this because maybe our hypotheses were actually a little off because we've learned this. So you want to summarize what you've learned and compare it against where your hypotheses were. And it's a moment, again, to inspire and educate the team forward. Maybe it's stuff that they had to learn this particular way. So it's never I think we think of too many of these moments as being binary. It's either a success or a failure. When actually, to me, everything is always a success. You're always going to learn something. It either reinforces something you knew, or it actually points your team in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
And it's a
Sometimes I
matter of
say,
navigating that.
oh, sorry. Yeah. Sometimes I say
Yeah.
surprises are where the insights come from because it's something that you hadn't known before. So I love that approach.
Yeah.
Speaking of coaching and mentoring your team kind of along this journey, there was a question in the chat about like, how would you recommend coaching or mentoring non-research colleagues, even UX designers or other stakeholders on the 5-step process that you shared?
It's honestly repetition. So if you have, and I'm not saying this has to be, it's not like you have to use this, it's not about using this particular 5-phase process and there's nothing else. Have a process is all I'm saying. So if you don't have one, feel free to grab ours and say you're using our process. It's great. We'd love to share it with you, but have a process and use those words. Educate people with using those words. Words matter in a big way. Even when it comes down to the questions, somebody could say, well, I asked the question, does the City of Boston website generate a sense of trust and confidence? Well, you know what I mean. I want to know what people are talking about. Well, that was not your question. Words make a difference. So have people own that. And I will say one thing, Lauren, is that with that workshop, with that facilitation, we often find that at the beginning, people are a bit loosey-goosey with their words. And by the end of it, they're actually crumpling up post-it notes that they've written questions and they're rewriting the question with better language. And they're like, I didn't really think about the fact that the language makes a difference. But language does matter. In
Yeah.
research across the board, language matters in the way we socialize the data, not only to the participant who we owe them a responsibility to accurately represent their data, but also internally socializing that, the words we use, how we ask, how we question, all of these details, the words matter.
Yeah. I love that. And I completely agree. And something else that you mentioned a second ago about just have a process and make sure you're re-emphasizing the words.
Yeah.
And I think early on in your presentation, you said something along the lines of structure and transparency lead to confidence.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times for folks, research can be nebulous, or especially if there aren't numbers related to it, can decrease confidence. And so I love your approach of creating that structure to help them along in the journey. Do you have any recommendations for folks? And this is a question that came up in the chat for when you're used to dealing with stakeholders who are truly quantitative in nature, how to get them to understand the value of qualitative research and how to communicate, what it is you're doing and why it's important.
And a lot of times it's not because quantitative, as you all know, has its place and incredible value. So when they are pro-quantitative, if that's fair to say, it's great. And you want to understand the variety of the solution they can get from quantitative. So a lot of times cities in general, for example, coming back to the city of Boston, we did a project with them many years back with the Housing Innovation Lab for a completely different problem. And in that time, it was very interesting when we were talking about housing. What they very quickly noticed was everything was numbers driven. You talk about housing and why people are getting driven out of the city of Boston and the city's being gentrified, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted to understand sort of how people make housing decisions. Everything that they had data wise was numbers. It was square footage of your house, the number of people living in your house, your age, your income, how many children do you have, so on and so forth. I can keep going. It was numbers, your income. And it was supposed to be middle income population that we were going after, which even though it sounds grand, I don't come up to you and say, hi, Lauren, my name is Mina and I'm middle income. I really don't know what the hell that is. So there was so many numbers at play that at first it was a bit of but we have all this data. But the question is, how is it informing you when it comes to asking people and making decisions about choosing a home, which is possibly one of the most personal things a person does? How can you actually get your solutions from numbers? And it's a great question to ask. It's simply remove the emotion and ask the question. How can you decide on a solution based purely on numbers? And what is your confidence again in that? I hate to say it, confidence will just keep on rearing its ugly head. So ask them about the confidence. Where is your confidence coming from? What are you basing it on? And if they are fine with those numbers, again, at some point in time, there's going to be a hole that pops up because at some point in time, you have to understand the rationale. You have to understand, as we all know, the why, which we always say. But it's more than that. It's more than the why. It's also that moment of emotion, because quants do not capture emotion well. And we need to understand that there's emotion when you buy a home. You walk into a home and you go, oh my God, this is it. This feels like home. How do I actually quantify that? And there are questions that you ask to make them meaningful. And even if it makes them go, huh, and they don't agree with you right away, you've planted the seed. Give them some
Yeah.
time to adjust.
Yeah, that's excellent. There's so many nuances to humans that you just can't always answer with numbers. And as humans, like, that you put your stats on a paper, like that's not me. Like that's about me, but it's not me.
Yeah.
But we do know, there's quantitative data is necessary and sometimes helpful. And there are some questions in the chat about at what points in the process you presented do you recommend pulling in some of those quant pieces, and how do you marry the two?
Great question. So, and this is where actually, for anybody who wants to look it up, um, the phase one align workshop, the 2x2 is really beautifully described in Medium. So if you want to read through that, but this is actually where, when we talk about discovery and exploratory work, where you're looking at really trying to understand people independent of product. And if they bring in product or if they cite product, that's fine. But you're not leading with product. Those are moments when you want data to be qualitative and open-ended and, story, based, if that's fair to say. Where it becomes more important and quite honestly more impactful to bring in details that are quantitative is really when you start to connect those characteristics to your product. Because then you can say, I've observed and I've learned from all of these people, and I've taken all those characteristics and I've applied it to my product. Now let me see how successful my product is. That to me is where quant is, just so fantastic, because it verifies and it validates, and it does with numbers, which do make a difference. So it's like you have to place it properly to always amp up the qual, or potentially on the reverse, if you lead with quant, you then understand there's magnitude of a problem. You can then investigate that problem, investigate that problem and get more detail on it qualitatively. So it just depends on that situation and that scenario, if that's fair to say, which
Yeah.
can make that difference.
Yeah, that's great. And kind of going back to that qual versus quant.
And I don't even like the verses. I usually stop. It's qual and quant, or quant and qual.
Yeah, that's true. There's always some kind of tension, but we know they work best together. So
We
there
wish
was,
everybody would
yes,
do that.
there was a question in the chat that I thought was a good one of, sometimes we hear one data point from a single person, a qualitative data point that we know from a, research perspective, it is valid. You can see it, you hear it, you understand it. And since it only came from one person, other people might say like, we're not going to act on it. It's not important. It's from one individual. Like, how would you approach a situation like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes back to that analysis portion that I was talking about, where don't reduce it to numbers. Is
Mhm.
it making you think more deeply? If the question is yes, it's accomplished its job. Has it widened your horizon? Has it increased the aperture of your lens? Have you now the ability to go, we were thinking about all of this, and now there's this one that's out there. All it's done, you're widening it to include it, and you consider it. And maybe it's that one that just makes the design team go, oh my God, there's a different way to look at this. I can look at it this way now. Did we ever think about this? People, pay attention. And it just jumpstarts what it needs to do. It's not about it being 1 or 0 or how many. It's about the fact that it has, because the design team does not rely on people to solve problems. A lot of times research is, I look at questions and people ask a very common question like, Lauren, how would you want this designed? And I cringe at those questions, because guess what, Lauren? well, you might be a designer. I'm not taking that away from you, but let's pretend you are a financial analyst in a company. And I suddenly ask you, how would you like this financial dashboard to be created? Like, how would you want to design it? Who made you a designer suddenly? And why am I putting that burden on you? And why do you have to suddenly take on that responsibility? Your job as a participant is to tell me about your world, your story, your experiences, your realities. And my job is to hear the gaps, because you might not call out some gaps, but I might notice that you're taking an awfully long time to get to something that shouldn't be that difficult. And if I can cut it down and give you complete confidence in what you're doing and show you the value, that's my job. So all I'm doing is hearing that variety and embracing it so that I can come up with a better solution for you if I'm the creator.
Yeah. And you said something earlier too about, you know, the insights or the questions that you ask come up with things that help ideate. Like there are things that help the team figure out new solutions and come up with new things. And that really resonated with
I
me.
mean, how many times are teams put on the spot and said, and we've worked with teams like this, you have to come up with 3 new baby products, nursery products in the next 4 weeks. And they're just like, based on what? Like they're all looking at each other and just like, oh my gosh, like, what do I do? And how do I do this? That's just so difficult at that point in time. It's hard, and it puts a very unfair responsibility on the design team, where they suddenly have to conjure up ideas as opposed to root them in something that's realistic.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of getting a little more tactical, you'd mentioned when you're developing like a project plan, you start with the ideal and then you work with the constraints. There were some questions about, you know, what are some common constraints and how do you get around them? And specifically around like, what if you have a stakeholder with a super aggressive timeline and like, you can only do the bare minimum? Like, what do you recommend in those instances?
That's my favorite. That's my favorite. Okay. I don't know. I actually, you know what? I have a hat here. That's what I wear when I start to get very ugly. Literally. So that hat to me represents the answer to that question. So when people come up and say, we only have 2 minutes to do this, or, you know, a week to do this, and what can you do for us? And we have to have you do this. And that means they haven't been exposed the effort that goes into getting answers to a question. My guess in those moments is a lot of times those teams are the ones that scurry away and do their work and scurry back and put something on the desk. And if nobody has that understanding of the effort that's involved, then that person is going to keep on asking exactly what they're going to ask. The other way to look at that is if somebody says, I have a week and you have to do this for me, I will do that once, only once. And especially if it's a repetitive ask or if it's a different kind of study, I will present the ideal. I will share the adjusted based on my constraint, which is now, it should have taken 5 weeks, but now we're doing it in 1 week. This is how we're going to shorten things. This is what you're going to lose. And make sure that they listen to what they're going to lose. Because all it means is that, and especially in this agile world of ours, all of these people who are planning and who are budgeting have purview into that many months in advance. So if we do these sessions where we actually talk and think and understand the amount of time it'll take to do something, I'm going to educate you as a stakeholder. And then the next time you're not going to come and say, I just have 1 week, I'm really sorry. You're going to plan it in for the 5 weeks it is. And I help you and we work together. That is the transparency I was speaking to.
Yeah. I love the focus on collaboration throughout the entire process and transparency. And, you know, in my mind, that builds a lot of what you're saying, is that builds that trust and confidence and shows the value of what you're doing. And so it's a great point. There are some questions, it sounds like, for some either newer folks or just learning about research, but what are some of the most common pitfalls for new folks starting out in this process? And what do you advise against doing?
What do I advise against doing? You know, so if I can, what do I advise against doing? I have to think
Or just,
about that
I
for a
guess,
second.
just what are some of the common pitfalls that you see that we should watch out for?
the common pitfalls, and I don't mean to jade anybody, but I'm sure the other researchers on this call. So in all of the workshops that we have run and literally around the world, the problems are one and the same. Stakeholders lead with method. They come and tell me, I have to run this focus. You have to, Mina, go run this focus group for us. And we need the data. Like once, if you're done on a Wednesday, we need the readout by Thursday. Anybody who starts to mandate how you do your job, don't let that happen, because it's your job. You know your stuff, and don't let somebody tell you how to do your job. You need to understand how you can work together in order to come out with the best high confidence output that everybody will want to consume. If it is something that is gratuitous and that it's not presented in a way where people are actually going to use that information, then you actually need to call that out as well. Research teams just generally have to make that difference where you can bring everybody together, but also be willing to call out bullshit, for lack of a better term. So if you find that you have a process, and I would advocate you have a process, so don't go in without one. And if you find that somebody's either trying to hijack it or trying to push you into a corner, or just minimizes the value of it or negates the mindset of people coming in to see the value of what you're doing, do not give up and keep opening that lens, keep opening that scope and ask about confidence. Because even let's say it trips up and you have a problem and somebody doesn't listen and everybody goes, well, we're just going to focus on quant data, again, comes back to the previous questions. After a while, there's going to be an absence of knowledge. And when that absence of knowledge happens, you will step in and say, I have a possible solution. I can't imagine, and there are teams that are difficult. I know that, we've worked with them, I'm aware of it, but I also want to give the benefit of the doubt that sometimes people just don't know. If they're not researchers, they don't know how this all works. So go in and be transparent. If somebody says, you know what, oh, I heard about something called a diary study, you're not going to go, oh, you don't even know what a diary study is. Like, who are you to tell me what I'm doing? Listen to them, educate them. Don't be dogmatic of that approach that you want to take. Think about, hey, maybe this person, well, let me tell you why a diary study is not going to work. Because that's really good for longitudinal, but it's not as good for this moment in time that we're looking at. What's going to be a little bit more impactful is this. But if you're interested, we'll find something later on. And when we have to do a diary study, I'll be sure to include you. There's ways to invite participation and make sure that you own the process, somebody doesn't hijack it, and that they partake of it and respect the effort that goes into that process, because that is imperative. People think anybody can do research. Lauren, can you ask a question? You ask questions all the time. Therefore, you must be a researcher. That's like me going to a designer and saying I can draw and therefore I can design. Like, ew, that's just wrong on all accounts. So we have to be respectful. We have to give them space. And quite honestly, if you find that you don't have the space, I will say in the extreme situation, and I just finished teaching my graduate course last week, and somebody brought this up saying, I have been there for 5 years and I have beat this drum left, right, and center. I hate to say, perhaps it's not the right environment for you. Don't be scared, because there are plenty of environments that actually want to do this. They just don't know how to do this. And they need to have somebody come on board that sails the ship.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have, I think, time for one more question,
Sure.
If you've got time. And this one, I think, was +1 a few times, and it's a bit different than where we've been going before. But folks want to know, like, what are the types of questions that you ask to elicit the ideal story from users as part of the information gathering phase? So, if you're not able to ask them, like, what does your ideal experience look like? How do you elicit that?
The ideal is fun, because it's actually like, it's, again, we employ a very activity-based protocol. So a lot of our questions aren't really questions, they're activities to get people to think. Because this is another talk that I've given many times, where it's all about really understanding, like, this whole thing about the right question is, I think that myth has to be debunked very quickly, because it puts too much responsibility on the researcher So I, the researcher, have to come up with the perfectly worded question. I don't know about you guys, but when you put a discussion guide together, nobody picks up their discussion guide and goes, hello, Lauren, I would like to ask you a question. Like nobody's going to read it verbatim. So we're so obsessed, we spend so much time on it, and then we end up not even reading it. I haven't quite understood that one. So instead, having an activity-based protocol really puts the focus on having that participant who is honestly the less fortunate in that moment, because they don't know the arc, they don't know which direction you're going in, they don't know what you're trying to go after, they know nothing other than the fact that they have their own stories. So that's why they keep on going, is this right? Like, is this what you wanted? Like, I don't know, is this what you're looking for? Those are the kind of questions they ask. So the moment you can take it over to an activity and you can actually have them reflect on their own moments, that's when you've hit the jackpot. So a very common one for IDEAL, for example, is using an activity that we use as like a metaphorical statement. So we did this with a company that is a utility, basically, and they were talking about energy efficiency programs. Their observation was people were just actually selecting one energy efficiency program and never signing up for another. Although on their website, there are a bajillion of them. And when we use metaphorical statements, we say, your experience of finding energy efficiency programs is like ... sort of like a Mad Libs. I would like it to be more like ... Now, my favorite response that sticks in my memory is a participant saying, I feel like this experience of selecting energy efficiency program is finding a needle in a pile of needles. Not even in a haystack. That's ugly. I wish it was more like ordering a burger. Now, one could say, well, great, Mina, what does that tell you? It actually tells you a lot, because you start asking, why a needle in a pile of needles? They all look the same. And there's a bajillion of them. I just see a whole pile, and after a while it becomes a blur, can't see anything. I need to see the differences. I need to see that there's big needles, small needles, fat needles, whatever it is. I need to see all different sizes of needles. And I need to then be told what the difference is. And I also need to know which needles I've tried before. And they suddenly start to use their own metaphor and they're telling you the details. But what would be really awesome is if you could package them for me and say, I want the number one. I'm not changing a thing. I want the tall soda. I want the fries. I want the whatever it is. I want the number one. That's it. Make it easier for me to consume that information instead of giving me a list of 200 or so. And I'm not even joking, it actually was sort of a list of 200. It was just like mind-boggling looking at it. But it's deconstructing the characteristics. We do this with brands. You know, if Uber was your fridge, you know, what would you want it to do? Okay, let's deconstruct Uber as a brand and what it means to you and bring it over and talk about how it applies to your fridge. So it's about deconstructing those details. And the best part of it is when you make it an activity, you have that joint canvas like I showed in the example here. The moment people can actually see that joint canvas and they see their details, they'll be like, oh my God, like this is really interesting because I did this and I did, oh my God, I didn't even realize I do these things. They themselves have their own reflections. That is invaluable because this isn't even coming from you. You barely have to say boo and they will start to jump all over the place. You just have to keep them tight to what you need and have them really dump out their mind and make sense of it.
I love that. Now I have a new activity. I've got a new phrase, a needle full of needles.
In a pile of needles. Oh my God.
Just
That
learning
visual is
all
ugly.
kinds of things from you. No, it was effective.
I know, it's like ugliness.
Well, Mina, this has been such an awesome event, and thanks again to you for presenting. Everybody, give Mina another round of applause. There's been lots of comments in the chat about rewatching it, wanting the slides, gonna look at the recording, and just really, really appreciate you sharing your insights with us, Mina.
No problem. I hope it resonated, and thank you everybody for listening. I really do appreciate it. I'm always happy to share. So really appreciate it. Thank you again, Lauren, for all the setup and everything, and to Jen as well. I know she's unavailable today, but just really thank you to the whole team. It's really kind of you to put this together.
And Mina was also gracious enough to say, if you guys have additional questions, reach out to her on LinkedIn, but with a caveat of please let her know where you saw her so she has context of who you are and where you came from. So make sure to connect with Mina as well. And with that, I will get us to our next section.
Fantastic.
Okay, can y'all
And
see my
Lauren, just
screen?
so
Yeah.
you know, I'm going to just run away really quickly to get my daughter, and then I'll be back on as soon as possible. It'll be super fast.
Absolutely, no problem at all.
Okay, talk to you soon.
All right, thanks again, Mina. So please do take our follow-up survey. We want to know what you thought of tonight's event, and we as researchers rely on feedback to make things better for you. So please do fill this out, and we'll pop the link to that in the chat. Really appreciate that. We thrive on data, and so that would be great. And the next part, which is a crowd favorite, is our breakout group networking. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's see if I can pause the recording. Anyone learn anything interesting about how to handle challenging team members? Learn something new? Have a fun story? Aaron, you have something?
Yeah, so I wish I still had the graphic, but I had a cheat sheet at my desk a while ago of just the top 5 type of difficult personalities. And one of them that stuck out to me is, that the person that says, yeah, I'll do that, but then never does. And it had a good couple ways, like once you've identified those difficult people, here's some tactics. So I know those are out there. There's probably a graphic out there you could easily find on Google, but like that type of person that says, yeah, I'm gonna get to that. You got to give them deadlines, and kind of learning those different personality types. I thought was, always been beneficial to me in all my careers.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think oftentimes when we think challenging, we think maybe rude or abrasive or something about their personality. And what you're talking about is like just maybe not as reliable as you'd hoped, or maybe not as results focused. So that's an interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing. Freddie, did you have something?
Yes, but well, I was actually going to be asking if anybody had resources, because right now I'm trying to like get myself accustomed to working through hypothetical projects, like in I guess like in an interview kind of way. So I was, if anybody has like any knowledge of like maybe where I could find some potential prompts just to get myself like prime and like and practice that would be amazing to share. And then also I'll put my link in the chat. That's all.
Awesome. Thanks, Freddie. And I will do another plug for our Slack channel. We do have a Slack channel with a ton of different people in it, with researchers and all kinds of things. We have a specific resources channel where people post helpful things like that, and you can request things, and just general channel to connect with folks and share. So highly encourage our Slack channel as well. I would super appreciate the question, and everybody please send Freddie some resources. Great question.
Bobby and I were in a breakout room together. Oh, this is Aubrey. I didn't raise my hand. Sorry.
No worries, to go for it.
Okay, thanks. Bobby and I were in a breakout room together, and we were a little confused if this question was about difficult team members or difficult participants. So we talked a little bit about both.
Yeah.
But Bobby has a quantitative research background and I have a qualitative research background. So we kind of talked about how occasionally, so like, for example, I do research in higher ed and I study resilient students occasionally. So I was talking about how like you want to like identify actually some of the outliers who might be considered difficult from a quantitative perspective, and to get some more, do some more detailed qualitative analysis to figure out in that case, like what traits and behaviors are helping those students succeed so highly and be resilient, so you can then help cultivate those traits and characteristics in other members of the population or the sample who were not achieving at such a high level. So yeah, we talked about difficult participants instead of team members, which was fun.
I love that perspective. I like, too, like what you said, like solve for the extremes and you'll ultimately help everybody. I mean, I'm sure if folks in here have run research, you've probably run into some interesting participants at time and had to pivot. I used to do a lot of research with car dealers, which was super fun, super interesting, and have a lot of good stories from that. Yeah, anyone else have a question for the group or for other folks? Tom.
Do you find that since you're doing research over Zoom and it's being recorded, that you have less problems or few problems with certain personality types versus in person?
Good question. What does anyone have any feedback on that one? Any answers for Tom? Everyone's been pretty shy today. No one's got thoughts on
Stop recording.
that? I mean, I can take a stab at it unless it was someone else coming off mute.
I think with Zoom, with working remotely in general, having a problem is way less than in real life, because due to the fact that sometimes in real life you interact in a negative way that shows your expression way too aggressive, and then the other person get aggressive and then they would just back off or do something wrong. But in Zoom or in whatever platform that you are using, we usually tend to keep calm more than actually getting annoyed. And if somebody is being annoyed, they will just turn off their camera and that will be just fine. And I think it's just less aggressive in remote life than in real life. I don't know. What do you think, Lorraine?
I think that's really interesting. I think it is like you have screens between you, so maybe the temptation to have bad behavior is different. And like you said, you could just turn it off, turn your camera off, or just disengage. It's a little easier than when you're sitting right across from someone. It's funny you mentioned recording as the big shift, Tom, of like, are you recording? You're recording on Zoom or not recording in person? I always recorded in person, and I felt like it was more invasive in person to record because you have to, get them to sign a consent and you tell them you're recording, and then you have the recording device or, camera or whatever it is. And so I often feel like on Zoom, people forget because they're so used to being on screen that, I don't know if it's challenging behavior or just being more candid, but people maybe forget you're recording and maybe you're more likely to share. I don't know if there's any truth to that. That is just what my gut tells me. Anyone else have thoughts? Good question. Interesting one.
Yeah, this is Anthony. I think I wouldn't call it bad behavior, but it's a behavior that I never really saw in person, which is I'll have participants that become distracted by their environment a lot more than in person. And that's the one thing that I've noticed happens more on web calls.
Yeah. Along that line, Anthony, like I still prefer in person to remote because you only see like this much of the person, whereas if you're with them, you get the visual cues, you see what they're working on, you see their space. If you're doing ethnography, it's much different than, seeing how someone presents in a little square, but that's my personal bias creeping in. Anyone else have thoughts on that one? I think we could do a whole presentation, or someone could, on online research and how it's different than in person and how to cope with some of the challenges. Yeah, Bobby in the chat, labs versus ethnography versus Zoom would be super interesting. Anyone else have a different question or comment? Or
well, I think how that presentation goes, right? It's all about the, don't choose the method before you go into it, right? But then once you kind of know, once you've done that project and I think it's good to have a couple of different method options to have, right? Like for instance, my company does recording and quantitative review as you're doing the activity, but you don't want to go into that saying, hey, we have Try My UI, we have to use it for everything, right? You want to say, hey, this one don't go into the method first. Try and find out that story, what you're trying to do, find out that persona first, have that kickoff first, and then decide what is going to be the best way to capture that. Because then you're not going to get stuck in that trying to force the participants into this one certain tool when you're like, maybe we'll get better feedback if we do it in this other method.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's kind of human nature to have your go-to or your favorite methods and kind of relying on those as a comfort mechanism, but being open-minded to other methods and if it solves your problem or fits your objectives better. Who else has got a question or comment for the group? I know it's Thursday, end of the week, depending on what time it is. Probably people are hungry, tired, but love to hear maybe one or two questions if you got them. Aaron, did you have something else?
Yeah, just to change topic, I asked this in our breakout room as well, so Aubrey probably doesn't have to answer this, but I was asking what tools do you guys use to gather both quantitative and qualitative data at the same time, or do you use separate tools for each one? Like, what are the most common tools you guys are out there using?
Yeah, anybody in the chat, feel free to answer. Just unmute yourself and pop in.
My team will often do qualitative interviews on user testing. So we'll do maybe 10 participants and we do usability interviews. So it's not strictly usability tests, but we'll also ask some propositional or questions that will get at like a little bit of propositional insights as well. But then when we want to validate, we can launch a 100-person study on user Zoom. I'd be curious to hear what the other tools people use are.
Anyone else have different tools?
Well, mine is Try My UI, and yeah, that like user Zoom and the user testing are competitors there, but same type of thing you can do. You can just, ad hoc, you can select your demographics as well as asking screener questions. So like if the standard demographics don't work, you're like, I want people who are age 34 to 60, but they also have to love cats on a scale of 8 out of 10, right? You could ask that question, say, I want those 34-year-olds, right? Those people that really love cats. So yeah,
that would be very, oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I'd be very interested in watching that study.
Yeah. No, there's interesting ways you can try and, do those pools. But again, you also run into that bias when you're using those tools is because all the participants are getting paid $10. So, they've kind of got that motivation. Sometimes there's those people that answer the questions just to see if they can get into the test. And you don't really know, you'll know you have the basic demographics, but with a nuanced question that specific, you kind of have to ask it in a different way so they can't just select the right answer, that you're looking for to try and get into that test.
Yeah. If anybody else uses other tools, go ahead and pop them in the chat. And Tom, you had another question or comment?
Yes, I want to kind of tie back to Mina's example of determining trust or trying to gather data on trust issues among your sample size. But especially on a government website, if you're doing it for a government website, then I guess your leading assumption will be people have internet access. So you've already limited your sample size to people who have access to the internet. And maybe that's a poor subset of people that you want to try to gain some insight from versus people who don't have access to internet to be able to access the government websites, who are probably the ones that you really want to find out more information from. So the tools that you use to gather that is actually already being limited by who you can actually gather information from, because you've kind of ruled them out.
Would you say that you, even if you try and mitigate that with doing the test in person, like providing them internet, if they don't have internet, and even if you put them in a room with it, it's kind of a moot point because, you know, they might not be even familiar with navigating the screen in the first place.
Yep. Yep. And maybe they're skeptical to access the government website for whatever reason, or they don't want to. Maybe they're ashamed that they can't afford to get internet access to be able to access government websites, or they have a language barrier, and you know they're among the group that's kind of underserved. And nowadays, you know, I don't know if anyone wants to be in person, unfortunately.
Yeah. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting proposition, Tom. You know, a lot of us work on digital products, so there is an assumption that we're only talking to people with internet access, and as sort of a baseline, because they can't use your product without it. You know, in terms of wanting to go in person or remote, I've asked myself through the pandemic, I don't know if I'll ever do a lab-based usability test again. It reduces so much friction to be able to do it online because there's no travel time. I have to pay a lower incentive. I can stack my sessions closer together. There's just, yeah, I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day, you know, I remember when I built our first usability lab at Intuit in Plano, and we had cameras that went down from the ceiling to show their hands on the keyboard. I never looked at those. I always just did the face with the screen, and I get that now. So, and I'm actually, yeah, I'm sort of, I think the big thing where I kind of wonder is, like you said, Lauren, is when we're really doing observation and, you know, ethnography in whatever form we try to do it, that becomes very difficult remotely, because if you really want to see the environment that they're working in, and it can be that's the nut I haven't cracked remote. I'd love to know if somebody has done that well remotely.
Yeah, Anthony makes such good points. I honestly, in the 2.5 whatever years of COVID we've been in now, kind of forgot about our usability lab and all of the, you know, expense and crazy technology to get all the camera angles. And I'm just thinking back to, did I ever look at it? No. Was it super expensive and hard to run? Like, yeah. Are we getting just as good as insights online? Maybe, like probably, maybe 95%. So that's super interesting to think about. But yeah, ethnography is the tougher nut to crack. Edward, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, hi. I was just going to second, I think, what both of you were talking about, where I think I just find it, I'm surprised myself often, is that just the ubiquity of what Zoom has, where I late last year, did about a 40-seat study with roofers in the American Southwest. And, you know, 3 years ago, I would have said it would have been probably hard to arrange, you know, the environment, you know, to run an appropriate interview. But all of them had Zoom because all their kids had it for their classrooms, you know. So like the massive technical adoption that we've seen since COVID across the board, of where I think many of us probably we challenged if we were talking to somebody who might be an older adult or English as a second language or something along that lines a couple of years ago, that friction is just not there anymore. So it's like the much wider pool of people we can talk to has been really deepened, I think, you know, despite the awful pandemic. a lot of people can hop online and have an interview now that I don't think they could have 3 years ago.
That's such a great point. And it even reminds me of QR codes before too. I think a lot of people tried to get people to adopt QR codes, and then until the pandemic, it wasn't as ubiquitous. And I mentioned earlier, most of my test population was car dealers, and they are salespeople to the core, not so tech savvy. And if you would have tried to set up a Zoom interview 3 years ago, they would have been like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't even really know like how to do that. Like, no way, you're going to have to come to my office. Fast forward through the pandemic, everyone has Zoom. Everyone knows how to work Zoom. It's way easier. So yeah, I've definitely seen that in my own experience. All right, Tom, we're gonna leave you with the last question or comment and then head out.
It just dawned on me that the underserved community is probably a lot smaller because they do have some mobile device ready. And so that led me to think that they may not have a computer, where if you're designing for a website, then you got to kind of design for, mobile device, or have that in mind when you're trying to identify your sample of people to enter. You have to know your audience basically, and you can't maybe necessarily mix them, or would you? People who only have desktop versus people who have only iPads, or just only use their phone for everything.
I mean, it depends on what you're trying to learn and your screening criteria. Like
just go back to the main topic of determining trust. So just from the website.
Just so I make sure I understand, are you trying to get at like, does it matter what type of device the person is using when you're doing screening, or did I totally misunderstand that?
Yeah, should, in your selection of your sample, do you need to know, what devices they have ready to be able to help you answer the question, to determine whether they can trust the system? It's one thing to know they don't have access and you'll never get them. But if most of the people have cell phones and they only use cell phones, then you're dealing with a much smaller screen in which to display information versus a desktop with a wider screen real estate. So do you mix those people in that group and then having to try to, or do you kind of keep them separate?
I mean, I'll definitely, I'm very passionate about this topic, so I'm glad you raised it. And then I'll let other people hop in too. First of all, like this day and age, 2022, if you don't have at least a responsive for mobile and tablet, like you've got some big other problems, right? And so when you are doing testing, you probably should be testing on all device types and be recruiting folks that are going to be using different devices. So I've definitely seen in screeners, like, what are the technology pieces that you use? How often do you use them? How comfortable are you with them? And depending on the objective of your study, knowing that would be really important, and you could go even deeper. Now, if your study is on like, why do humans trust different websites than others? Like, and it's not a usability study, maybe it's not as important, and you're actually just understanding human factors and you just want to talk about human things. You're not even going to get to the device till later, till you're actually testing your solution. So it really depends on where you're at. But I highly recommend testing on all the devices when you get to that point.
I think so. I have to work on some kind of a project where they are heavily depending on desktop. Like I have worked on a project, it's IDE, which is basically the tool that developer use to develop, but it's in a cloud service. And that particular product will only be used on the desktop. Like I don't think anybody will ever use it on mobile. And even though when I was doing some like tracking for the user using Full Story, like they would just come on the marketing website with their mobile, but then they would switch to their laptop. So on that kind of a particular, if I'm pronouncing it right, project, then I think that's the only place where you would care about the desktop and never really care about the mobile side. But again, the desktop has iPad size, like, every 320 pixel, it gets bigger. So from 640 and up there, that the iPad size and the laptop size. And that's when it should be cared about, the small part, big part, where it's cyclicable, where it is taking the hierarchy and stuff like that. So yeah, it depends on the product, I would say, from my experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if you have the data to combine it, like if 100% of your users are using it on desktop, like, go for it, design for that. However, we are becoming an increasingly mobile world. And I just put in the chat, but in my last project, we thought it was all desktop. It was, again, a tool for dealers that are sitting at desks. And when we looked at the data, we found, I think, like 5% of folks, which is small, but still sizable, were trying to use it on their mobile device. And we were like, uh-oh, that's terrible experience for them. So, I mean, it all comes down to prioritization, but you're right. I think some things are meant for different screens sizes. So you don't always have to test all of them, but keep in mind like how your users are using them. Meet them where they're at, basically. Great point. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for sticking it out, connecting with each other, networking, and hanging out in this happy hour. We really, really appreciate everybody just taking time to connect with others. And there are a few links in the chat if you haven't followed us on social media to hear about our next events, filling out the survey, and definitely joining our Slack channel. It's a great place to connect with others and even meet others in the same industry or line of work. If you do have any other questions, feel free to pop them in the Slack or message us through Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the things. With that, I will say to everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever time it is for you, and we'll see you at the next event. Bye, everybody.